Robert Johnson pushed his cart through the steep streets of Oak Ridge on the outskirts of Chicago. With every yard covered, sweat trickled down his wrinkled forehead, marked by decades of hard work. At 58, his body no longer responded with the same vigor, but his determination remained unshakable. While sorting through recyclable materials, Robert observed the movement of the awakening city. Hurried executives in their imported cars passed by him as if he were invisible. Some even looked away, as if his existence were an inconvenience, a blemish on the urban landscape. Robert held no grudges. He understood that each person lived in their own world. His was simple: wake before dawn, traverse the streets of Chicago in search of recyclables, and return to his small rented room at the end of the day. A routine he had repeated for more than 3 decades, ever since his father Anthony departed, this world leaving him only the old collection cart as inheritance. What no one imagined was that behind those worn clothes and calloused hands hid a secret, and a man who had transformed his reality in an extraordinary way, far from the gaze of others. "Dad, for God's sake, how long will you continue with this?" "Life?" questioned Mark, his oldest son, whenever he visited. "You're too old for this. You can live with me and Jessica. We don't need luxury, but at least you wouldn't have to dig through trash anymore." Robert just smiled. He kept to himself the secret that would forever change the concept his 3 children had of him. It was on a rainy March afternoon, 5 years ago, that everything began to change. While rummaging through a dumpster in the Oak Brook neighborhood, Robert found a relatively new tablet. He could have sold it for a few $dozen, but something made him take it home. "Let me see if this gadget still works," he muttered to himself, connecting the device to the only power outlet in his room. To his surprise, after charging for a few hours, the tablet turned on. The password had been removed, probably by the previous owner before discarding it, and Robert found a world of possibilities he had never imagined. At first, he used it only to watch videos on YouTube and follow the news. Over time, he began to take interest in videos about economics and finance. The words were complicated, the concepts complex, but Robert had something that many trained economists didn't possess: an extraordinary capacity for observation and infinite patience. "Stocks, dividends, compound interest," he repeated, softly, while noting each new term in an old notebook. At night, after long work days, he dedicated 2 or 3 hours to studies. He used the free Wi-Fi from the plaza near his home, or when it rained, asked to use the network at the coffee shop where he sometimes bought coffee. In an investment forum, he created a profile with the name Investor Chai and began interacting with other users. It was there he met Professor James Wilson, a retired financial analyst who, without imagining he was guiding a recycling collector, became his virtual mentor. Dear listeners, Robert's journey is just beginning. If you're enjoying this story of overcoming and transformation, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any episode of this inspiring saga. And now let's continue following the steps of this extraordinary man. "Mr. Robert, what are you always doing on that tablet?" asked Jerry, a fellow collector who found him concentrating in the plaza one day. "Oh, just watching some videos. My friend, an old man like me needs some distraction too, right?" he replied, changing the subject. Meanwhile, his children continued with their lives. Mark, the oldest, worked as a salesman in an appliance store and always felt uncomfortable when someone asked about his father's profession. Linda, the middle child, was an assistant in a beauty salon and had a less conflicted relationship with Robert, although she also wished he would abandon recycling collection. Edward, the youngest, was studying business administration with great sacrifice and visited his father the least, always too busy with college and internships. "Dad, Edward is graduating next month," Linda commented during one of her visits. "He really wants you to attend the ceremony." "Of course I'll go, my daughter. I wouldn't miss that moment for anything," replied Robert, his eyes moist with pride. "But he asked if you could, well, wear more formal clothes if possible." Linda hesitated, embarrassed. Robert just nodded. He understood his children's embarrassment. He didn't blame them. After all, they grew up hearing malicious jokes from peers about their garbage man father. What they didn't know was that, during those 5 years, The knowledge Robert acquired through the tablet had transformed into concrete actions. With his first $200 saved, he made his first investment in a stock recommended by Professor Wilson. He followed the market with meticulous attention, learning to identify patterns and opportunities. The secret is patience and consistency, investor key, Professor Wilson wrote in forum messages. There's no miracle, just discipline and knowledge, and Robert had that in abundance. He continued his daily routine as a collector, but every penny saved went into his investments. In just over 2 years, his small reserve already exceeded $20,000. That's when he decided to open an account with a digital broker, using a post office box address as a reference since his rented room didn't have an official proof of residence. In his 3rd year as an investor, Robert met Richard Norton, a market operator who promised extraordinary returns through riskier operations. Seduced by the possibility of multiplying his assets, he entrusted a considerable part of his savings to him. With these $15,000, I can triple your money in 6 months, Mr. Robert, Richard guaranteed during one of the rare face-to-face meetings they had. It was his first and biggest mistake. 3 months later, he received news that Richard had disappeared, taking with him the money of dozens of investors. The pain of betrayal was immense, but instead of giving up, Robert extracted his most valuable lesson from it. Never again will I let anyone control my money, he decided as he reorganized his strategy. He went back to exclusively following Professor Wilson's advice and his own intuition, which refined with each day. He diversified his investments between stocks of solid companies, real estate funds, and government bonds. His wealth grew slowly but securely. At 58, when a strong flu hit him that Chicago winter, Robert had already accumulated a fortune exceeding $2 million. He lived in the same humble room, wore the same simple clothes, and continued his collector routine. Not out of necessity, but by choice and strategy. "Dad, you're coughing up blood," Linda alarmed when visiting him. "We're going to the hospital now." Reluctantly, Robert was taken to the emergency room. The diagnosis, severe pneumonia, aggravated by years of exposure to the elements. He would need to be hospitalized for several weeks. "Who's going to pay for this?" asked Edward, concerned about finances. "Our situation isn't the best." "Don't worry, my children," replied Robert, with a weak voice. "I have a little money saved for emergencies." The 3 siblings exchanged glances, imagining that the little money would barely cover a few days of hospitalization. They decided that each would contribute what they could to not leave their father helpless. While Robert recovered in the hospital, Linda went to his room to gather some belongings he had requested. That's when she found, under the old bed, a locked metal box. "I wonder if the key is around here," she asked herself, rummaging through the few drawers in the room. She found a small keychain hidden inside a book about the financial market, which she had never imagined her father would read. With trembling hands, she opened the box and couldn't contain a cry of astonishment. Inside were various documents: bank statements, stock certificates, real estate fund contracts, and a handwritten notebook with detailed notes about each investment. The combined values exceeded $2 million. "My God," muttered Linda, unable to believe what she was seeing. "How is this possible?" She took the box to show her brothers, who reacted with the same perplexity. "This must be some kind of mistake," stated Mark, incredulous. "Maybe they're documents he found in the trash." "No, Mark, look, everything is in his name, and there are recent statements," replied Linda, showing the dates on the documents. "So our father is rich?" questioned Edward with wide eyes. "And he continued collecting trash all these years? That doesn't make sense." The 3 siblings decided to confront Robert as soon as he was discharged. Meanwhile, the news of the secret fortune of the collector leaked, probably through a hospital employee who overheard the children's conversation. In a few days, the story of Robert Johnson, the millionaire collector, became a national phenomenon. Journalists began to circle the hospital and the small room where he lived. Neighbors who barely greeted him now wanted to give interviews talking about their longtime friend. When he finally was discharged, Robert found a completely different scenario from what he had left. Reporters waited for him at the hospital exit, and his children escorted him to a taxi, avoiding statements. "Why, Dad?" asked Mark as soon as they arrived at his apartment, where Robert would stay during recovery. "Why did you hide this from us? Why did you continue living in that misery having all this money?" Robert sighed deeply before answering. "My children, money was never the most important thing to me. Seeing you grow up, study, and become good people, that was my true wealth." "But you could have lived better," interrupted Edward. "You could have helped us more. I almost gave up college several times for lack of money." "And I would have helped if you had asked me, son. But you never asked," replied Robert serenely. "You always wanted distance from me, from my work, from my life. I understand you. No one wants to be the garbage collector's son." The heavy silence that followed was interrupted by Linda. "And now, Dad, what do you plan to do with all this money?" "It's all already decided and registered with a notary," he replied. "Part of it will finance the construction of a financial education school for children and young people from the outskirts. Another part will create a support center for collectors and low-income workers. And there's a third part. That goes to us, your children," Edward completed, anxiously. Robert smiled with a certain melancholy. "This third part also has a specific destination, but first I need to tell you how it all began." At this point, Robert narrated in detail how he found the tablet, how he began his studies in finance, and how he met Professor Wilson on the investment forum. He told about his first investments, the mistake with Richard Norton, and how he rebuilt his wealth with discipline and patience. "But there's still an important piece in this story," he said. "The tablet that changed my life belonged to someone." Through the device's history, Robert had discovered that its former owner was Charles Miller, an executive who lost his job after a financial scandal involving the company where he worked. Although innocent, Charles saw his career crumble and, in desperation, discarded several belongings, including the tablet where he kept personal projects. "I found Charles 2 years ago," Robert recounted. "Today he works as a rideshare driver, struggling to rebuild his life. What he doesn't know is that 10% of everything I've achieved is reserved for him." "What do you mean, Dad?" questioned Mark, indignantly. "You're going to give your money to a stranger?" "He's not a stranger, son. He's someone whose destiny crossed with mine in a mysterious way. What was considered trash by him became my treasure. It's fair that he participates in this story." The revelation generated even more conflict among the siblings. Edward, in particular, couldn't accept his father's decisions. In his view, the fortune should stay in the family. "But what about us, your children?" Edward insisted. "Don't we deserve anything after so much struggle?" "You deserve much more than money," replied Robert. "You deserve to learn the real value of things. That's why my will establishes a condition. To access the part of the inheritance destined for you, you'll need to manage the social projects for at least 5 years." The news fell like a bomb. Edward left, slamming the door, while Mark remained silent, processing the information. Only Linda seemed to understand the depth of her father's decision. In the days that followed, media exposure intensified. Television programs offered significant amounts for exclusive interviews. Companies wanted Robert as their spokesperson. There were even proposals for a book about his story. In the midst of the turmoil, a familiar face appeared at the door of Mark's apartment. Jerry, Robert's old colleague from his collection days. "So it's true," said Jerry with a mixture of admiration and hurt. "All these years you had money and never told us anything." "It wasn't that simple, my friend," explained Robert. "If I changed my life overnight, how would I explain it? Where would the money come from? I preferred to keep up appearances while building something bigger." "You could have helped me," exclaimed Jerry. "How many times I struggled and you were there, pretending to be as poor as me." The accusation hurt Robert. He had never thought that his secret could be interpreted as betrayal by those who shared his journey. "I never wanted to hurt anyone, Jerry, but I understand your anger." The encounter with Jerry made Robert reflect on the consequences of his choices. Perhaps he had been selfish in keeping everything secret, or perhaps, by revealing his fortune, he would have lost the essence of what really mattered. Meanwhile, the story of the millionaire collector was gaining unexpected dimensions. Young people from the outskirts began forming study groups about investments. Recycling cooperatives began to include financial education in their meetings. The impact spread like waves, far beyond what Robert had ever imagined. Charles Miller, the former owner of the tablet, learned of the story through television. It didn't take long for him to connect the dots and realize that the device discarded years ago had been the catalyst for that extraordinary journey. "You don't owe me anything," said Charles when meeting Robert in person. "It was my carelessness that made the tablet end up in your hands." "I don't see it that way," replied Robert. "Your device was the tool that opened my mind to a new world. Without it, I would just be surviving, unable to create something bigger." The conversation between the two men lasted hours. Charles told how he lost everything after being unjustly accused of fraud, how his wife left him, and how he slowly rebuilt his life. "You know what impresses me the most," said Charles. "While I, with all my academic education and market knowledge, crumbled at the first obstacle, you, without formal education, transformed an opportunity into an empire. It's not about formal education, my friend. It's about persistence and purpose," replied Robert. "And speaking of purpose, I have a proposal for you." Robert invited Charles to be one of the managers of the financial education school he was about to found. With his academic knowledge and market experience, he would be the ideal person to help shape the curriculum and pedagogical approaches. "Why me?" asked Charles, surprised. "Because you know both sides of the coin. You know what it's like to have everything and lose everything. This perspective is valuable for those who never had anything." The partnership between the millionaire collector and the failed executive soon became another fascinating chapter in that unlikely story. Edward, after weeks of revolt, finally decided to talk to his father again. The forced cohabitation during Robert's recovery had created a space for reflection. "I still don't agree with everything, Dad," confessed Edward, "but I want to better understand your plans. How exactly would this administration of social projects work?" Robert explained in detail how he visualized the functioning of the school and support center, how each child could contribute with their specific skills. Mark with his talent for sales, Linda with her empathy and communication skills, and Edward with his training in administration. "It's not just about distributing money, son. It's about creating real opportunities for transformation, and you three are fundamental pieces in this project." Gradually, Edward's resistance gave way to curiosity. The idea of managing a project of that size began to awaken his professional interest. Mark, meanwhile, remained distant, processing the recent revelations in his own way. It was on a Sunday afternoon, while helping his father take his medications, that he finally expressed his feelings. "You know what hurts the most, Dad? All those years when I felt ashamed of your profession. How many times I lied to friends, saying you were retired instead of a collector, and you were there building a wealth that many executives in suits and ties would never achieve." "Don't blame yourself, son," replied Robert, squeezing Mark's hand. "Our society teaches us to value appearances, not essence. You were just following the script that everyone follows. But you managed to break that script. How? Perhaps because I never had anything to lose. When you start from zero, each achievement is an extraordinary gain." The sincere conversation marked the beginning of a new relationship between father and son. Mark began to regularly visit the room where Robert had lived all those years, trying to understand how someone could create such wealth in such a small space with such limited resources. While the Johnson family reorganized, the fame of the millionaire collector crossed borders. Journalists from other countries wanted to know his story. Invitations for lectures arrived daily. Robert refused most, preferring to concentrate his energies on implementing social projects. The financial education school began to take shape. Land was acquired in the same community where Robert had lived for decades. Volunteer architects developed the project, incorporating sustainable solutions, including the use of recycled materials in construction. Charles Miller took over pedagogical coordination, developing a methodology that combined principles of financial education with human values. It wasn't just about teaching how to make money, but understanding the true value of things and people. Linda, increasingly involved, left her job at the beauty salon to dedicate herself fully to the project. Her natural ability to connect with people made her the perfect spokesperson for the initiative. "I never imagined I would be doing something like this," she confessed to her father. "I always dreamed of having my own salon, but this fears much bigger than any dream I've ever had." "Sometimes, daughter, life prepares us for paths we didn't even know existed," replied Robert. The big surprise came from Edward. Initially the most resistant, he became the most enthusiastic about the projects. Using his knowledge in administration, he structured a management model that would ensure the financial sustainability of the initiatives in the long term. "The school and support center need to be self-sufficient," he explained during a family meeting. "We can't depend only on the initial money. We need to create recurring revenue sources." Robert observed with pride the transformation of his children. More than money, this was the legacy he wished to leave, the ability to see beyond appearances and create positive impact in the world. Media coverage, previously focused only on the unusual aspect of the story, began to highlight the social projects and the message behind them. Robert, who always avoided the spotlight, agreed to participate in specific interviews when he perceived he could inspire other people. "You never thought about using your money to simply live well, travel, buy a comfortable house?" asked a journalist. During one of the rare interviews he granted. "To be honest, no," he replied simply. "I learned to live with little and discovered that my happiness wasn't tied to material possessions. Of course, I won't go back to sleeping on the floor or going hungry. But what drives me is seeing the impact we can create when we use resources consciously." Robert's words touched people from different social classes. The wealthy reconsidered their relationship with money and consumption. Low-income people found inspiration to seek financial knowledge without losing their essential values. The Support Center for Collectors and Low-Income Workers was inaugurated 6 months after Robert's hospital discharge. A renovated warehouse offered space for meetings, free legal consultation, basic medical care, and mainly professional training. Jerry, who initially felt betrayed, accepted the invitation to coordinate the collectors' cooperative linked to the center. His experience on the streets was invaluable for structuring more efficient collection routes and better negotiations with recycling companies. "You were right, Robert," admitted Jerry months later. "If you had revealed your money before, probably none of this would exist today. People would have seen only the money, not the message behind it." The financial education school named New Tomorrow Institute opened its doors at the beginning of the following year. In addition to children and adolescents from the community, it also offered evening courses for adults who wished to improve their relationship with money. Mark, using his talents in sales, secured partnerships with companies that began to offer internships to the most outstanding students. Linda developed a mentoring program, connecting successful professionals to young people from the outskirts. Edward implemented a microcredit system that allowed students to start small businesses with specialized monitoring. What began as the story of one man evolved into a larger movement. Other communities began to replicate the model. Robert received constant requests for guidance to implement similar initiatives in different regions of the country. 1 year after the hospitalization that changed everything, Robert finally fulfilled a personal desire. He visited the house where he was born in rural Illinois. Accompanied by his 3 children, he returned to the small rural property that his father had been forced to sell decades ago due to financial difficulties. "It was from here that we left in search of a better life in Chicago," he told his children as they walked through the now abandoned property. "My father believed that in the big city we would have more opportunities." In a way, he was right, although not in the way he imagined. During this trip, Robert revealed to his children his last major project, the purchase of that property and its transformation into a rural school that would combine financial education with sustainable agricultural practices. "The cycle will close here," he explained. "Where everything began, a new beginning will be possible for other families." The revelation especially moved Mark, who had always shown interest in country life despite never having had the opportunity to explore it. "I could coordinate this project, Dad," he offered, surprising everyone with his enthusiasm. "That's exactly what I hoped to hear, son," replied Robert with a serene smile. Upon returning to Chicago, one last surprise awaited the Johnson family. Professor Wilson, the virtual mentor who had guided Robert in his first steps as an investor, discovered the true identity of his pupil through the extensive media coverage. "When I saw your photo in the newspaper, I almost couldn't believe it," the professor recounted during his first face-to-face meeting with Robert. "Investor Chai was a recycling collector. You challenged all my prejudices. And I will be eternally grateful for your teachings, Professor," replied Robert. "You never treated me differently, even without knowing who I was. Because in the world of investments, it doesn't matter where you come from, but where you're going," philosophized the professor. "And you, my friend, went further than many of my students who had all the advantages from the beginning." The meeting with Professor Wilson inspired yet another initiative, a virtual mentoring program that connected finance experts to low-income people with limited access to formal education. Technology, which had transformed Robert's life through a discarded tablet, would now serve as a bridge to transform other lives. As the projects consolidated, Robert gradually stepped back from the front line, allowing his children to take on more and more responsibilities. His health, although stable, still required constant care after the severe pneumonia. "You need to rest more, Dad," insisted Linda. "Let us take care of everything now." "Rest?" laughed Robert. "I've spent my entire life working. Work isn't a burden for me. It's what keeps me alive." However, he agreed to reduce his pace, dedicating more time to guiding young people and less to the administrative issues of the projects. He moved to a simple but comfortable apartment near the New Tomorrow Institute. He maintained frugal habits, demonstrating in practice that wealth and ostentation don't need to go hand in hand. 2 years after the revelation of his fortune, Robert received recognition he never sought, the title of Honorary Chicago Citizen, granted by the City Council in recognition of the social impact of his initiatives. During the ceremony, simple at his request, he gave a brief speech that summarized his philosophy of life. "I am no different from thousands of Americans who wake up every day and face the streets to ensure the sustenance of their families. The only difference, perhaps, is that at some point along the way I understood that knowledge, when applied with discipline and purpose, can transform not just one life, but many. Money itself has no value. The value lies in what we do with it." The speech, broadcast on television, inspired a new wave of similar initiatives across the country. Recycling cooperatives began to include financial education in their activities. Public schools invited former students of the New Tomorrow Institute to share experiences. The impact multiplied organically. Edward, who had initially been the most resistant to his father's ideas, became his greatest defender and promoter. He abandoned plans for a corporate career to dedicate himself fully to managing social projects. "I never imagined I would find so much satisfaction in working with people that society makes invisible," he confessed during a family dinner. "I always sought recognition in positions and titles, but true fulfillment was where I least expected." Mark advanced with the Rural School Project in Illinois, rediscovering his roots and connecting with a lifestyle that had always secretly attracted him. The property, previously abandoned, gained new life with agroecological techniques and an innovative educational model. Linda expanded the mentoring program, creating bridges between worlds that rarely met. Her natural charisma attracted volunteers and sponsors, ensuring the sustainability of the initiatives. As for Robert, he found deep satisfaction in observing the transformation of his children and the growing impact of his projects. The man who for decades had been invisible in the eyes of society now saw his legacy multiply in ways he never imagined. "You never thought about writing a book telling your story?" a journalist once asked him. "My story is still being written," he replied with a serene smile. "Not by me, but by each young person who discovers they can be more than the world expects of them. By each worker who understands that their value isn't defined by their occupation, by each person who learns that true wealth lies in the impact we leave on the world." The saga of the collector who became a millionaire and transformed his fortune into a social legacy continued to inspire people throughout America, not for the money itself, but for the powerful message it carried. That knowledge, when combined with purpose and resilience, has the power to transform seemingly immutable realities. And so, between trash and treasure, between the visible and The invisible Robert Johnson had built not just a financial fortune but a much more valuable treasure, the ability to see possibilities where others saw only limitations. The end of the story. Dear listeners, we hope that Robert Johnson's journey has touched your hearts. If you were moved by this story of overcoming and transformation, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like to this video every day. We bring unique narratives that explore the complexity of life and the possibilities for change that exist within each of us. Don't miss our upcoming content. Share your opinion about Robert's story in the comments.